Very nice to see you all. And the first thing to say is a very warm and happy Christmas. I know it's not very warm in here. Some people want to get around the heating system, but hopefully you'll stay for a drink afterwards and warm yourselves up. We've got hot pasties, treats, and drinks of various kinds. So please stay for a Christmas celebration. Just a couple of things I wanted to mention before we get to the talk. One is that you can't fail to notice by now that we're celebrating our 10-year anniversary. This is going to culminate next May, 25th of May, so please save the date. We've got the great and the good coming to see us on the day. We'll have a cake, we'll celebrate. But in the afternoon that day, we want to have the culmination of our future forecasting process. That's what we're calling it, future forecasting. So we're basically saying, we're looking back over the previous 10 years, what have we achieved? And we're going to be sharing an infographic that we've been working on today to try and capture everything that's gone on. And we'll share that with you shortly so you can add the bits we've missed. But then we're also going to be saying what's coming for the next 10 years. So what are the big environmental challenges that we anticipate now, that we should be thinking about now, working on now for the next 10 years? And I sent around an email, hopefully you got it yesterday, with a link. There's a very short online form, and we're hoping to get at least 10 ideas from all of you. And over Christmas, you might have some ideas because you'll have time to relax and think and read and look at the TV and stuff like that. So anything that comes to mind, however far out or unlikely, please make a note of it. Please put it on the form. We're going to try and get these ideas from everybody. So anyone you know who's creative with ideas or interests, get them to fill it in. We're going to then do a bit of refinement and share it back with you probably in February time. And then we'll do a bit more work on getting at least 10 big ideas that we can work on the afternoon of our big celebration in May, and come up with something that really everyone can get excited about for the next 10 years. It might set us up with some big research projects and ideas for things we can do. So I really hope you'll take part in that and give us your ideas over the next few months. Anyway, we're really pleased that Callum Roberts is with us today. I was just checking with Callum when he came to join us, and it turns out it was in July 2020, which is not a great time to join an organisation like this. So some of you probably haven't had the chance to meet him, because this is the first academic year when things have been a bit more normal since he's been with us. But he has a very, very illustrious record of research and activism around the marine environment. We're incredibly lucky to have him with us in Exeter, but also Penryn, but also do this talk. He's going to do a talk on some really exciting work he's been doing in, as he says there, one of the world's most extraordinary places. So I'm really looking forward to this. There's going to be some brilliant pictures from West Papua, which is the centre of marine conservation at the present time. Just a couple more things about Callum. He's written some really valuable books, one of which I actually had on my shelf. Here it is, The Unnatural History of the Sea. But since then, he's written a book called Oceans of Life, a beautiful picture book as well about secrets of the sea with lots of images. And his latest book, I think, is called Reef Life. So I think that's enough from me. We're really pleased that Callum's here. He's going to talk for about 40 minutes or so, and then we'll have time for questions and discussion. So over to you, Callum. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And it's a great pleasure to be here. And a long journey back from the Centre of Biodiversity. One of my favorite books as a child was Journey to the Centre of the Earth by Jules Verne. And getting to the Global Centre of Marine Biological Diversity feels difficult, but not quite on the par with that. But anyway, what I want to talk to you today about is a journey that I have just completed to the Centre of Marine Biological Diversity in Raja Ampat, which is, if we sort of zoom in here, zoom out on the left-hand side, we've got Indonesia, and the Bird's Head Peninsula and Raja Ampat are illustrated here on the right-hand side. And you can see that Raja Ampat is this little box that I'm highlighting for those in the room, but not for those who are joining on. mind about that. You can see it yourself, but it's called, it means four kings, Raja Ampat in Indonesian, and that's because of these four islands here, the main islands in this. And this is part of this wider Bird's Head seascape. But the reason why it is so important is because it lies in an area of great biological richness, and the terrestrial environment has fascinated people for a very long time. Some of the early explorers and the founders of biological sciences spent a lot of time out in this area, and they one of their pastimes, it seems, was to draw lines on maps showing all the various biogeographic subdivisions of the region, and this was based on the fauna and flora of the various islands. And here you can see Wallace's line, which was drawn by Alfred Russel Wallace, comes down here between Bali and Lombok, indicating a major transition in the biological communities on those islands. Now, the marine environment has been explored much more recently, and it's only in the last 40, 50 years or so that people have been spending a significant amount of time underwater and documenting the marine biological diversity there. And of course, the ecosystem which kind of defines the region is coral reefs. And I like this quote from Charles Darwin: "We feel surprised when travelers relate accounts of the vast piles and extent of some ancient ruins, but how insignificant are these, are the greatest of these, when compared to the matter here accumulated by various small animals." And it's that accumulation from various small animals that has fascinated me for all of my career. I got into studying coral reefs as an undergraduate student at the University of York back in the early 1980s, the days when Kevin was still a PhD student in the same department on the same corridor, and we rubbed shoulders during that time. Now, marine biological diversity has fascinated me for a long time, and I started out working on the biodiversity of reef fishes and some of the things which controlled that biodiversity. And Julie and I have collaborated. Julie Hawkins in the front row here, who I said I would call out if she fell asleep, blaming jet lag from the long journey. But we did a paper quite a long time ago now, which was essentially mapping the biological diversity of tropical coral reefs. And what we did was to map over 3,000 distributions of different species of fish, corals, snails, and lobsters. And you can see those longitudinal patterns in biodiversity kind of concentrate in Southeast Asia, in this region here. And there's a good degree of concordance in the patterns among these different taxa. You know, there are nuances, there's differences among them, but the general hotspot of richness is in the central part of this Southeast Asian region. And that has been variously described as the coral triangle. And I say variously described because if you're going to delineate the boundaries of anything which is subject to the vagaries of distributions of species from different taxonomic groups, and everyone has a different way of doing it. But essentially, this coral triangle is the richest place in the world ocean. And one of the things that fascinated me is, well, why is this the richest region on the planet? Well, first of all, it's got a lot of coral reef area. 1/3 of the world's coral reefs in just over 1% of the ocean's area. And the reason that this is so significant is that, you know, one of the kind of primary laws of biology is that species richness increases the bigger the area you sample. So if there's a lot of habitat, you're going to find a lot of species. More on that in a minute. This is a study which looks at various ecoregions within the coral triangle and looks at the number of species. And you can see here that the Bird's Head Peninsula region actually comes out right on top with 553 species of corals, which to give you a sort of sense of how different that is from other parts of the sea. The Caribbean has about 70 species of corals, the Red Sea about 250, the Maldives about 170. So it's a lot more. I mean, it's really on a very different level. The other thing about the Coral Triangle is that it's also the center of biological diversity for other habitats, associated habitats, one of which is the mangrove. And so if you plotted the distribution of species richness of mangroves or of seagrass beds, they follow very much the same kind of pattern with that concentration of species into the Coral Triangle region. And I was lucky enough to swim with these fish. Anyone know what that fish is? It's an archerfish. It is an archerfish. Well done. From the penguin man at the front, an archerfish is exactly that. And these archerfish are famous for being able to spit and knock insects out of the canopy and thereby eat them. But absolutely beautiful ecosystem in itself and incredibly rich. Now, I'm sort of beginning to allude to why is this the richest place in the world ocean? And the answer to that is multifaceted. Here are some of the main things which are behind that richness. And I mentioned the species area effect. The fact is that we have the biggest area of coral reef habitat anywhere in the world, and you would expect to find a large amount of reef biodiversity there. Another hypothesis behind the richness of this region is that it's a center of speciation. And one of the things behind that speciation is the Pleistocene sea level rises and falls over the last 2 million years or so. And so there has been what has been called a species pump. And as the sea levels fall, it isolates the region into different basins, which then promote subdivision of species, which then promotes speciation. Another hypothesis is that it's accumulating species that have evolved in other areas. And so this is a region that is gathering up biodiversity over time and maintaining it. And one of the reasons that it's been maintaining it reasonably well is because it has sustained coral reef habitat for a long time compared to other parts of the world where the ice ages really led to a lot of reef habitat being wiped out and uninhabitable by these species, and then therefore species going extinct. So here there's this idea of a refuge from those Pleistocene sea level lows. So in terms of the species area effect, within the Coral Triangle, the richness is just incredible. And if you were to go on a determined several-hour snorkel and scuba dive in the center of biodiversity here, you would be able to rack up probably 300 species of reef fish without very much difficulty at all, if you were able to identify them, that is. There are a handful of people in the world who could jump in the water and be able to go there and identify all of those 300 or so species of fish. In terms of corals, that richness is also really incredible. And you can see here going up to the hundreds of species once you start sampling more and more areas within those. And that compares to, you know, slightly under half the diversity in Red Sea sites. So that's the kind of species area side of it. But the Pleistocene history of the Coral Triangle is one of this isolation into various basins. And here you can see 116 meters below present sea levels. Various parts of this have been isolated into separate basins in which species are then subdivided into separate populations. The idea is that they subdivide, they then evolve separately, and then they come together again as sea levels rise. And that seems to be behind these kind of clusters of species which have are pretty similar, but they have distinctive differences. And then when they come back together again, they are reproductively isolated. And here is the basis for the Wallace line, which I mentioned earlier, for terrestrial ecosystems. And so essentially that's where it comes through. And you can see that the sea level low never joined Bali and Lombok. They remain separated. And so these were areas that, in particular, land-based animals and short dispersers couldn't get across. Now, in terms of accumulating species, the Coral Triangle is in a very good position to do that because currents feed across the Pacific Ocean from east to west normally. And so you've got all of these islands, which are potential sites of speciation, which then are potentially bringing species into this Southeast Asian region. And because you've got such a large amount of habitat, then they are able to colonize, form significant populations there. Bigger populations have lower extinction risks. And so there's this accumulation of species over time. And then the other explanation that I mentioned was this idea of Ice Age refugia. And what this shows is during ice ages, this is the amount of remaining coral reef area. And this is the degree of isolation. All these little squares are places where coral reefs occur today. And what you can see is here, that the isolation from refugia is very low in the Coral Triangle area. And that there's a strong correlation between the degree of isolation and the present day richness of reef fish communities. And you can see that, the Caribbean was very isolated from refugia during Ice Age low sea level stands. In fact, there were major extinction pulses that went on in the Caribbean during those Ice Age low sea levels, whereas in the Coral Triangle area, it seems that there was plenty of refuge area within that region that never kind of got snuffed out by those ice ages. And so there's a stronger probability of survival through those periods of adverse environmental conditions. So what is it like there? And for that, I have to turn to our friend Alex Mustard, who was running a workshop for photographers in Missoul in the middle of Raja Ampat. And that's he invited myself and Julie to accompany him and to talk about science with all the photographers that he had there, while he talked to them about photography. Now, I hope that my photography has improved as a result of this. I'm sure my photography has improved as a result of this, but I'm not going to inflict it upon you now. I'm going to instead give you photographs from Alex Mustard from this part of the world. And one of the things that characterizes the region is probably one of the things that which has kept it really intact over time is that the islands are essentially karsts. They are made of limestone. The limestone has eroded very heavily over time. It's become incredibly lethally sharp. You can't inhabit that space. You can't get a foothold for a human population within that kind of area. It's just too impossible. And so people haven't gravitated towards this region over time. There are people here. There is a relatively low population size of people in the hundreds of thousands. They have livelihoods that are sea-based and land-based. They undertake small-scale fisheries. This is actually an anchored boat, which is used for catching anchovies and squid. And they just switch the lights on at night and wait for the anchovies and squid to come to them. So it's an interesting way of fishing. But there's also been a lot of reef fishing there over time. It's been inhabited for a very long time. And this is some wall paintings that occur in the region, and they're dated to about 3,000 to 5,000 years ago. If they're at the high end of that, then that's sort of contemporaneous with the ancient Egyptian civilization, for example. You can tell how old it is because this calcite has deposited over the top of these wall paintings. And you can see here's a whale, and there's dolphins in here and various sorts of fish. There's also something that looks a little bit like a penguin. I'm sure it can't be a penguin. But I did promise Rich a penguin here, you see. So we get, and also, you know, really quite striking the way that you can feel the presence of these people through their handprints. And this is another piece, and just up here there is a fish which is in silhouette, and I've zoomed in on that bit. It is a perfect silhouette of a surgeonfish, and we would find the same species of surgeonfish today, and they've obviously slapped the surgeonfish on against the wall and then sprayed ochre around it. And it's amazing what these wall paintings were actually inside a cave at one time, but then the roof collapsed and exposed them just right next to the water's edge. The coral reefs are pretty well developed here. They are extraordinary. This is the view from the balcony of the room in which we were staying, and you can, you know, you didn't need to get in the water to be able to feel like you were diving there. There was so much going on just below, and these are mostly blue corals, which one of the few coral species that has a colored skeleton. If you knock a piece off that, it's blue inside rather than white. But underwater, you know, the excitement of this area is incredible. There is a huge amount of life. It's a very, very productive area. And about the time of year that we went, there are very large schools of small baitfish, which means that there are spectacular numbers of reef predators around as well. The structure of the reef is very interesting because it's not a typical hard coral dominated reef environment. In fact, soft corals and other kinds of invertebrates are to the fore, and it's hard to see in this particular image any hard coral at all. They're mostly Gorgonian sea fans and octocorals, which are the soft corals, which is very typical of this particular area. There's also plenty of megafauna there. This is a wobbegong or a carpet shark, and it's famous for its manta rays. Manta rays in the Raja Ampat area have buddies, and so there's a social network analysis that's been done on sightings of manta rays, which indicates that they spend time with friends rather than mingling at random in the population. And so there's an interesting sort of structure to the population there. There are also just a whole series of remarkable creatures that you can find there, like this cuttlefish. And the action off the edge of the reef is very exciting. You know, it's good to be in among the sharks and all of these various predators that are lurking around, that are ready to mop up the abundance of these small bait fish. And right in front of the hotel that we were staying in, there was a seagrass bed, which is being chomped by green turtles like this one. And there are these beautiful scenes with sweet lips like these. And of course, anemone fish, which are very diverse in this region. I think, did they say 30? Like, no, that's 34 species of butterfly fish. Anemone fish, there's at least 12 to 18 species, wouldn't you say? Yeah, she's nodding. Now, one of the tasks that we gave the photographers was to get us a picture of a parrotfish shitting. And parrotfish are the generators of tropical beaches, and you wouldn't believe how long I've been looking for a good photograph of a parrotfish having a poop. And of course, with a whole bunch of photographers there, it wasn't very long at all before they started to compete. You know, who's going to provide the best picture? Well, this is quite a rarity, this species. It's a big animal, the bumphead parrotfish, and it produces copious quantities of shit, which gave them plenty of opportunities. Here's they form what can only be called herds of bumphead parrotfish. They are one of the few parrotfish that will eat coral directly, and so they're sort of grinding it up and generating this this sand. And before long, this particular photographer found himself in the midst of a shitstorm, which I love. Now that's all going into our coral reef field course in the Maldives next year, and students will understand the process, the geological process of sand formation on coral reefs much better as a result of this. One of the things that comes to the fore, though, in thinking about this region is just how is it that species are able to persist. And this is a study not from the Coral Triangle, but from New Caledonia, in the southwestern Pacific. And it was one of these intensive surveys to try and find every individual and every species of mollusk that occurs within the a particular area. And you can see that there was a lot of people spent a lot of time searching for mollusks. They came up with 3,700 species, which is remarkable because New Caledonia is not the most diverse area of the world. If you were to do this in Raja Ampat, you'd probably end up having another 1,000 species on top of that. But what I think is fascinating is the rarity of those animals, and you know that within that sample, 20% represented by just a single animal, and then there are a whole bunch of empty shells as well, which indicated the potential or the former presence of other species, and that sort of rarity fascinates me because, you know, there are many things that you come across on a coral reef which are, you know, almost unique in your experience, and you would go out on a snorkel and you would find new things every time. You know, when you go out on a snorkel in the Caribbean, you find the same things again and again and again, whereas here, you know, you can just move 5-10 meters and everything's turning over as you go along. And here's this wonderful nudibranch, which is on an ascidian. And these ascidians are about this size, and they're filtering seawater, and they have the most glorious colors. Here's another sea slug. If there's one thing that dive guides like, it's sea slugs. They absolutely fall over themselves to show you sea slug after sea slug after sea slug. You know, there's a shark out here and a manta ray going that way, but it's the sea slugs that tend to get them. Now, here is one of those very small species, which is quite remarkable, and that the region is rightly famous for. It's a Gorgonian sea fan, and just in here you can see this pygmy seahorse right here, curled around the sea fan, and it's an incredible creature. And, you know, one of the things that happens when you reach my age is that your eyesight is much less good than you would like it to be. And to try and see a seahorse that is just a centimeter and a half long is a challenge in itself, let alone something which is as well camouflaged as this. And thanks to the auspices of some of the local dive guides, I was able to imagine that I saw something moving there. Truly discovered the benefits of diving with a magnifying glass this trip, and we'll never be without one again. Here's another of those really small creatures. The smaller you go, it seems that the more different kinds of life that there are. Here's a little crab inside a sponge. And these creatures are something that I had never come across before, but are extraordinary. They are tiny little mushroom coral pipefish, and they live within and among the tentacles of solitary mushroom corals. That so these things are absolutely tiny as well. The other great thing about photographers is that they're bristling with macro lenses, and they can get right down. They never know if they got the shot until they sort of come back up, because they're not sure if it was in frame or whatever. But these are creatures that just to admire constantly. I love them. Anyway, promised that I was going to talk about the bad side of things. And of course, the bad side of things when it comes to coral reefs is that they are incredibly vulnerable to the impacts of global climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And what those greenhouse gas emissions have been doing is increasing the temperature of the world ocean. The ocean has been absorbing the majority of the extra heat that has been added to the planet since the onset of the Industrial Revolution. Over 90% of that heat is now in the ocean. And so you can see how when you take into account ocean heat as well as atmospheric heat, then pretty much every year is a record-breaking hot year in comparison to previous years. Now that's a problem for coral reefs because the coral is highly sensitive to temperatures being pushed above their normal thermal maximum. And when you push the temperature up by 1 degree centigrade or more and hold it there 4 to 8 weeks, they will bleach, and then they will die, generally speaking, because the corals are getting most of their nutrition from the microscopic zooxanthellae plants that live within their tissues. And the problem is that relationship is great when the conditions are clement, but that relationship breaks down when the temperature goes up. So they have to get rid of the zooxanthellae, but if they do get rid of the zooxanthellae, they will die unless the conditions improve and they're able to get the zooxanthellae back in time. So a bleached coral is a starving coral and under extreme stress. There have been various global mass coral bleaching events that have happened over the years. The first sort of regional one was in the 1980s, but the first global one happened in the late 1990s, and that caused massive coral loss across coral reefs all over the world. There was another really big one in 2015-16, which was in the news because of the effects on the Great Barrier Reef, causing intensive bleaching of corals there. This a year after the bleaching event. And this was a region of the research center that see the coral cover on that reef was very high, but what is also coral is dead. In fact, 99% done. So it was savage. Across the whole Maldives, 2016 bleaching event killed about 2/3 of corals. What's interesting here is that it killed 99% of corals. And the reason for that is the crown of thorns starfish, which is a coral-eating starfish. So when the bleaching killed 2/3 of the coral on this reef, there was less food for the starfish. They all came out and they ate all the rest of it. And the only corals that survived were corals that were inaccessibly within crevices, so they couldn't get their stomachs over those corals. And also there's a kind of branching coral that has a crab that lives within the branches, and that kept the crown of thorns starfish from eating those corals. So the crabs just basically attacked the starfish as they came up. So coral reefs are globally in trouble, and the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change has put together this analysis that suggests that we're going to lose a lot of coral reefs if we hold the temperature rise to 1.5 degrees centigrade or less. But we're going to lose nearly all of corals if temperature rise goes to 2 degrees centigrade or more. Now that's bad news because I think even the most optimistic people in this room will probably think that it's unlikely that we're going to be able to hold temperature rises to 1.5 degrees. Certainly not unless we develop some pretty rapid technologies for sucking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And so we're very likely to get into this kind of 99% loss. Now, these are predictions, and of course, the future is an uncertain place. So it may or it may not happen. This is what's happened in the Maldives. So this is some work by Julie's and my PhD student, Rhiannon Davis. And what she's done is to compile all of the available coral surveys that she could find from the Maldives and look at how coral cover has changed over time. And you can see these are less certain points because there weren't many coral surveys in the 1950s. So it could be that nationwide coral was up here, or it could be that it was around this region. But nonetheless, by the time that we get to the 97-98 coral bleaching event, there was sort of 30-40%, and that collapsed to a few percent. 91% of the coral was killed in that event. And then, of course, it started to heave its way back from the depths of oblivion. And then along comes this bleaching event in 2016, which led to 2/3 of the coral being lost. And it's beginning to come back again, but it's a struggle. Here's another study that Julie and I have been involved with. We went to Bonaire in the Caribbean. We went again this year, and we redid exactly the same surveys of fish and corals that we did then. And this is what we found. But first of all, 1994 was not pristine by any means. And in fact, it was just in the aftermath of a disease epidemic that had taken out 98% of all of the branching corals on those Caribbean reefs, the two major branching reef building species, staghorn and elkhorn coral. And you can see the aftermath of it there. But nonetheless, there was still more than half of the reef covered in coral in 1994. And yet this year, it's now a bit over a quarter. And you can see that there's been nearly a 50% loss of coral over the course of that 28-year period. What's interesting is that these kind of inert substrates, bare substrates, sand and rubble, are roughly the same kind of cover levels between these two surveys. But what's also different is that the amount of fleshy algae, fleshy seaweed, has increased on the reef, and the amount of coralline algae has decreased over that period. Now, fleshy algae is bad for coral growth because it shades it, it outcompetes, it's faster growing. And coralline algae is good because that promotes coral settlement and survival and growth, and therefore is important for conditioning the reef for coral settlement. Now, unfortunately, this trend is one that's going in all the wrong directions from the perspective of the long-term viability of coral reefs. And if I was a human doctor as opposed to a reef doctor, I would look at this and say, you're overweight, your blood pressure is too high, you've got high blood sugar, you're going to have to change your lifestyle. But unfortunately, the lifestyle that reefs need to change is our lifestyle, and that's the difficulty that we're facing. Now, Raja Ampat has a lot of coral. It is an area which, by dint of good luck and happenstance, has not experienced mass coral bleaching. And so during these global mass coral bleaching events, it has maintained its coral cover. It hasn't seen a mass coral bleaching like the ones that have afflicted other parts of the world. And that's probably because of localized upwelling, a lot of very vigorous circulation in that part of the world, which has prevented the hot water pooling as it has in other places. Showing you how rich in coral some parts of the reefs are there. Now, global climate change is not the only thing which has afflicted this region, and it was increasingly being targeted by roving fishermen who were coming hundreds or even thousands of miles from other parts of the region to hunt for sharks, very high value shark fishery based on finning. And the place that we went for this photography workshop is the Mosul Eco Resort. And when the people who founded that resort first landed on the island that it is on, this is what they found. These are photographs that were taken by somebody who was with them on that trip. And it was a shark finning camp. And there was intensive fishing, and not just shark finning, but blast fishing as well. And so, you know, when you blast fish, you chuck some dynamite or a fertilizer, homemade fertilizer bomb on the reef, kills all the fish in a certain radius, and then you pick up the dead bodies and take them away and sell them. But unfortunately, you leave the reef in ruins as well. And there's still plenty of evidence around Mosul, albeit recovering now, of areas which have been intensively bombed about 20 years ago. So they founded this resort and they bought up the fishing rights for a very large area around it from local communities, working with them, so they're getting an income from the fishing rights. They're not fishing there, and it has become a no-take marine reserve. And regionally, there has been an intensive effort to introduce broader conservation. So the Mosul area and its no-take zone is one part of a much bigger program of effort to protect this region. And you can see various sort of various milestones in the process towards the protection of this region. And so there has been, you know, science around how to design a protected area network to be resilient to future environmental change and impacts. There has been intensive work with local communities to get those marine protected areas integrated and supported by them. There has been also a great deal of effort put into the practical management aspects in this region. So it's the whole area has a network of protected areas now, which is based on really cutting edge science about things like representation of species and habitats and connectivity, ecological connectivity among those different places. And this is what we have. So Mosul, where we went, is here. This whole area is a big marine protected area, of which some parts are fully protected from fishing. And you can see that network also includes in Raja Ampat a whole series of other protected areas, and in the broader Bird's Head Seascape region, further protected areas around there. So it's a really globally significant conservation effort. And it came about as a consequence of both people locally working with international conservation organizations and the Indonesian provincial and national governments to bring this together. But it was also, you know, very much the grassroots, which was important in making this network of protected areas as successful as it has been. So people like Meiti Mongdong, who's a Pew Fellow in Marine Conservation, and I've had the privilege of meeting her on a number of occasions at the Pew Fellows meetings. She has been very influential in making sure that local laws and local people are behind the protected areas and that they're fully bought in to the whole process. And this is a network which is not one of these cases where, you know, people come in, they pump some money in and then they leave. It's actually something which is being supported over the long term, and there is intensive monitoring of both social, economic and biological indicators around here to make sure that the management is on track. And here is a map showing all the various monitoring sites. You can see ecological sites are in red, social monitoring sites are in green, and together this information feeds into an adaptive management plan, which is ensuring that this conservation effort remains on track over the long term. Now, the thing that often derails efforts like this is lack of financing, which I'll come to in a minute. Is it working? This is some BRUV data, baited remote underwater video, and you can see that in the no-take zones, there's a lot more sharks than in the open access zone. So that is working, and you can see scenes like this on the reefs now, and we were lucky enough to be snorkeling among these black-tip sharks. That's one of the spectacular conservation successes from the conservation effort that's been put in. This is another conservation success. Here is the humphead wrasse, very rare across much of Southeast Asia because it is extremely highly desirable and valuable in the live food fish trade in Southeast Asia, but it is abundant on the reefs around Raja Ampat, and the whole size spectrum from very large like this, which is over 1 meter long, to down to centimeters long. And I have never seen such densities of Napoleon wrasse anywhere in the world. So financing, a fund has been set up that will support efforts like ranger training, patrols, local education efforts, schools and outreach, ocean literacy. And so that is a source of funds for all of the different communities within the Seascape area. And the Blue Abadi Fund's goals to provide a secure and steady long-term flow of funds to ensure the sustainability of the Bird's Head Seascape marine ecosystems and species. And one other source of funds is from permits. This is my permit, and it cost the princely sum of about 60 quid to be able to visit there. And with multiplied by the tens of thousands, that is an important source of income for the area. The other final thought that I have in terms of the future, so we're doing everything right to try and protect it long term, you know, other than reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And the other sort of fairly unique feature of this environment is, as I said earlier, the lack of hard corals compared to the soft corals, gorgonians, etc., which are found within this region. And that, in a sense, could be a strength for the region because, you know, if it loses hard corals, it's not going to actually lose a lot of that overall fauna and flora, because it's a fairly minor element. And one of the things that we noticed in this region is that it isn't building particularly significant coral reefs. So here you can see, you know, some sort of reef development where the reef has grown over time, but around a lot of the islands, there is no fringing reef. There is simply rock, and there is corals on the rock underwater. They've never actually been growing fast enough to build a reef itself. So it's not like the Maldives or the Great Barrier Reef where there are these huge, you know, hundreds of meters wide reefs, but there is coral on these ecosystems, but mainly soft corals. And so it's entirely possible that this area will continue to be unique into the future, even as the climate changes. Let's hope so. So thank you very much. Beer and plastic.
Callum, they were lovely pictures to watch. Any comments, questions? Tom?
It was quite interesting you mentioned that there's like ice age refugia, and that might help to explain a lot of the diversity. And I was thinking, based on the fact that corals seem to be very sensitive to warming temperature, and presumably, although I don't know, that sea temperatures in the past at some point have been higher than they are today, would you think that something like that may also explain the coral diversity in the region?
That's a good question. And, you know, temperatures have been higher in the past. In the Eocene and the Pliocene in particular, the temperatures were really quite hot. And I was asked this question by one of the photographers in Mosul. You know, what was coral reefs like during that time? The answer is I'm not sure, because the science has yet to be done. But I did read a paper which suggested that the coral reef development wasn't very good during some of those higher ocean temperatures, and that they were sort of loosely consolidated calcium carbonate producing animals rather than, you know, cemented and growing ramparts of reef. So I think I will not speculate wildly here, but it's an interesting point, and I'd like to know more about it. But during the Eocene, for example, the water temperatures at the north got to around 20 degrees centigrade. So it was very markedly different from today. The world was a warmer place.
Thank you. That was so beautiful to just. I was wondering if you've got any kind of summary of the social impacts.
Social impacts of this protected area. Yeah. I haven't dived into that deeply enough to be able to tell you thoroughly, but from various presentations that I've been to that other people have been involved with, you know, there's been a lot of employment opportunities that have come about as a result of this. You know, fishermen have turned into marine park patrols. There's a large number of people being employed to protect sharks now rather than to exploit them. I think some of those distant water fishing expeditions are now being pushed out. You know, that there have been prosecutions and penalties applied for illegal fishing within the area. You know, a lot of it wasn't being done by local people. It was this sort of roving bandit type area. And you know, the region is not poor. People have a reasonable standard of living. And I think in the past, you know, it's often said that dynamite fishing is the last resort of the poor, but actually, when you go to a place like this and you see the abundance and the probable abundance, even under those heavily exploited times, it turns out that dynamite fishing is the resort of the incompetent, you know, people who aren't able to make a living by fishing using other means. The greedy, there's a lot of sort of gangster involvement in fisheries like that. And it isn't that, you know, they're poor. It's a shortcut to a fast buck. And it's an incredibly undesirable shortcut because it cuts off the future for them. So I think there's now a much greater understanding among local communities of the value of the marine environment, the sensitivities that it has, and there's a lot more education going on within local communities to that effect too. In terms of food security, I know that the indicators of food security have been improving in that area across the monitoring. But in terms of participation in governance, there is some way to go, you know, to make sure that people are properly involved in that. And partly that's because the Indonesian government has been sort of fluctuating between local control and national control over the course of that timeline of protected area establishment. So these things have still got to settle out.
Yeah, thanks. It was a fantastic talk. I'm a keen snorkeler here in Cornwall, and sometimes when I'm in the water, like last week, it's quite cold and the visibility is not very great. And I see these pictures of right now, I'm actually on Instagram, and I'm like, that would be really nice to go sometime. And I see from your talk that you can do a lot of good with these ecotourism kind of activities. On the other hand, of course, there's a massive carbon footprint flying all the way to the other side of the world. And I wonder what you think of this kind of dichotomy between, on one hand, protecting these ecosystems through ecotourism, but on the other hand, contributing to global warming and ocean acidification.
Yeah, I agree. It is a difficult thing to resolve. And let's put it this way, the people who are taking photographs there don't think about it much at all. And, you know, I have to say, for selfish reasons, I wanted to go there by by way of sort of pilgrimage for marine scientists to see the center of marine biological diversity, but it is a long way and there's a lot of fuel burned, and yeah, it's hard to reconcile that. Planting a lot of trees in my garden.
But the eco resort we stayed at was fully booked until the end of 2024. So there's no shortage of people desperate to go
Yeah.
to this.
Thanks for the amazing presentation. My question is really about your communication strategy as a scientist, and whether you have been always using visuals, particularly photographs, pictures. So that's one question. And the second is, do you feel like sometimes undermined somehow by your colleagues if you do scientific presentations using pictures and storytelling rather than hardcore data and fancy graphs?
I find that people stay awake much more in my talks if I don't get into the hardcore data.
This time of day.
But you know, I think storytelling is really important. That's why I write books, and visuals are really important. And one of the sort of lessons learned from this whole process of establishing this network of protected areas is the great importance of visuals for convincing government ministers and other decision makers to act to protect this place. So, you know, that acquiring really high quality imagery and film was seen to be a fundamentally important part of that communication strategy, and that's why they were so, you know, keen to protect that area. And when you see images of shark finning and so on, you know, the better the quality those images are, the stronger the messaging, I think, that you can put behind it. So there's a Society for Conservation Photography now, which is, you know, beginning to build, and quite a number of the photographers who were with us are sort of interested in thinking about how to communicate conservation messages through their photography, as well as just, you know, making great pictures. So yeah, I mean, if you look at my graduate and undergraduate lectures, they're full of images, and mostly Alex's. He's been a wonderful source. You know, if I can recommend one thing, is find a nice underwater photographer who's willing to help you, and you know, get as many images as you can from them, because they are like gold dust for telling stories about things.
Thank you very much for the presentation. I wonder, you know, what are the sources of energy that people use there? Very renewable energy.
In the whole of the region, or?
Yeah, well, maybe the main touristic areas.
Okay. So the eco resort, 60% solar and 40% fossil fuel. They want to get it to mostly solar, but they're doing it in phases. In West Papua in general, there's a lot of fossil fuel extraction going on there. So, you know, the main source of power generation is still fossil fuels.
Sorry, I was very late, so I missed most of your talk. What I heard was really fascinating. Thank you. I've just got a question. I'm sorry if I missed it. About you mentioned disease management before, the outbreak that went through the coral. Do you know much about what caused the disease, what disease it was?
Well, it turns out that much later on, I think 2 decades on, finally able to sequence the disease. They found out that it was a human gut bacterium. So sort of introduced from sewage probably into the Caribbean. But what's interesting is that, you know, Ebola is lethal 70% of cases if it's untreated. This was lethal in 98% of cases. So, you know, it's an incredibly virulent disease. And that's been the case with many diseases in the Caribbean. That's not just the only one. There's sea fan diseases, there's sea urchin diseases. They've wiped out, of the order of 90% or more of the animals that they've infected. And so it's not so much coral bleaching in the Caribbean that's caused major changes to the reef there. It's been multiple disease outbreaks. And there's a big disease outbreak sweeping around at the moment called stony coral tissue loss disease, which is a bacterial infection. I think it can be cured with antibiotics, but it is now devastating Caribbean reefs, and some reefs in the Caribbean down to 4% coral cover. Yeah.
Sorry, just to add that, because I know that I'm not biology research, but especially from this was looking at material communities in shellfish on the coast, and she found increased community numbers of certain bacteria that hadn't been visible. There was changes in bacterial communities in the shellfish, which is quite interesting. Later, the change in climate and pollution.
Well, what's also interesting is that probiotics and healthy, beneficial bacterial communities or microbial communities seem to impart some resistance to coral bleaching too. So, we're just learning more and more about this whole complicated process.
I was thinking that when you were talking about the diversity of this region, that's just the species you can see. So if you were to look at the microbiome of that environment and all the small or really small organisms, that might tell you a very interesting story about diversity.
It would.
Yeah.
Would it be interesting to see if microbes followed the pattern of the coral triangle? Something something for the next grant.
And because we don't see them, we don't take pictures of them, we can't talk about them. So this point about what we can see and not see.
Yeah.
And we're wiping out so many tiny organisms that we don't even know about. So,
There's some they can kind of do some prediction by modeling certain environmental factors and make predictions about where bacterial communities or events might happen. So cholera and things like that. So that's something you could do in the
Interesting. Well, I do know that plankton follows the same pattern as well. Certain kinds of plankton, forearms, for example, are richest in that coral triangle region, and very similar patterns. Anyway, this is supposed to be a part. So I suggest anybody else who has a question, feel free to come and join him and ask in person.
So a big round of applause. So please do help yourself